Welcome to Life Unrestricted.
This is your show if you're sick of living a life controlled by food and exercise rules, and if you're ready to learn how to accept yourself and enjoy the heck out of life. My gig is about body image, femininity, self-worth, and resilience. Come on, let's walk side by side as we slowly step out of restriction misery and unlock our true selves.
Your host, Merritt Boxler, is a former national radio DJ, freelance journalist, speaker, and writer with a passion to make women feel good in their bodies. This is a show brought to you live from Switzerland.
Hey, lovely radicals. It's Merritt again, happy as always to share another moment of my little existence here in Switzerland with you. And today we're going to do things a little different. We've talked about diet culture a lot on this podcast and how our being surrounded by weight loss promoting messages shapes how we view ourselves and how we feel about our bodies. And we're going to keep on talking about that for sure. Today, though, I feel like sharing some thoughts about what else it could be, apart from our parents and our appearance-obsessed culture, what else it could be that might also be influencing us in how we behave, how we perceive the world, how we interact with others, and how we view ourselves and our place in the world. Our country's culture, for example. The reason why I started thinking about this in the first place is that I'm loosely connected to an online group, I think they're based in LA or someplace, that does a lot of work around bringing awareness to how our upbringing in terms of what countries we live in, how that influences us, and how starkly that may vary depending on where people grew up or spent their most formative years in. And I'm interested in that because when I traveled to different countries, I remember how amazed I always was at how there really are vast differences to how people do interact, how hospitable they are, how open, how responsive, how authentic they felt or not authentic, and how welcoming. And I remember that I always had the feeling that as much as I loved the beauty and security of my country, I always, or almost always, depending on where I went, felt more welcome as a whole person in other countries. I remember how I felt, more seen as a person, and how I appreciated that people seemed to be much more open to approaching strangers, say, or how much easier it was to start conversation just off the cuff with people that I've never seen before, and how people approached me, and how I felt much more, shall I say, alive than when I returned home and was around Swiss people again. So anyway, I got interested in finding out what it might be that shapes our culture and how we as Swiss people show up and interact with the world, generally speaking, of course. I started reading about other countries' different traditions, how people from other countries have different viewpoints and blind spots, depending on the conscious or unconscious ways they were influenced by their country's values and roots, and how we really often can't help but being programmed in certain ways, and how much can be gained when we become aware of that programming and when we can start questioning some of the stuff that we kind of got handed down by our cultural mother's milk, if you will. I wanted to know why I often feel like my personality as it is just not really suitable for this country, for Switzerland. I find it hard to get through to people, to get beyond their wall of this reserved politeness that I just got so used to. And I find it even harder to make new friends, especially at my age, because it's almost impossible to go beyond the shallow banter with most people. And I often run into an exterior of cool indifference, this standoffishness that is typical of Swiss people. And it really hurts. Everybody seems just so protected, and that gets really lonely, especially in recovery. So when this group, this LA group, this cultural group, asked me to write a piece for them about Switzerland and our culture and the way that influences us and the way other people might perceive us, I did just that. And since I am a pretty tangentially speaking and writing person, my piece got lengthier and lengthier as I described a lot of my own story, especially relating to how I always try to be this picture-perfect person on the outside, deeply insecure on the inside, of course, and how I tried to protect myself from bullying and rejection by presenting a, quote, ideal body type and having a, quote, popular job and being a, quote, oh so independent, never needy person. And how this got me further and further away from health, from connection, and from my own truth. And let me just say that they did a good job at editing out all the stuff that wasn't necessary, which I guess was a lot. And still, the final piece that they published gives a pretty good overview about what might have shaped Swiss culture without getting too personal. But it really made me think about the pain I often feel when I realize the loneliness we Swiss people create for ourselves by being so cut off from our own vulnerability. And it really shows. It's heartbreaking how difficult it is in this country to find support groups where mental health issues, for example, are shared. And just how my own body image struggles are met with a silence so loud that it's often easier to just stay stuck in my old ways, than to keep up the will to recover. And there are so many people struggling in this country. Statistics show this. We have such a high rate of eating disorders, depression, and suicide, yet I have not found people who are willing to come right out and talk about their issues. And when I approached 2 existing support groups that I found on the internet, I got told that they folded the groups because, as they said, Swiss people tend to not show up, or at least not more than once. And just recently I got a message from a woman saying that she had organized a workshop about binge eating and that the few people that signed up ended up either not showing up, except for 2 people who proceeded to just sit there in silence, unwilling to share stuff. It seems like shame is keeping most people stuck in silence and isolated suffering, and that pains me for many reasons. Because as we know, shame can only heal when the silence is broken. And that's exactly what most people are least willing to do. Probably all around the world, but in this tiny country, this is a massive hindrance because Switzerland in itself is a very divided country. And people are great pretenders. And we're just not that many. Imagine, as for tiny, there's room for 222 Switzerlands in the United States. And we have 4 different official languages in this country. Plus so many dialects that there are people speaking the same language and hardly understanding each other. I hope that gives you an idea. It's all happening on such a tiny piece of land. And as I shared on the podcast before, I am a person that, feels other people deeply, whether I wish to or not. And I can't tell you how much fear I feel in this oh so trendy city I live in, Zurich. So many hipster people hiding behind their screens and all the go, go, go and trendy clothes and cool jobs and, all this, quote, coolness. It makes my soul freeze up, man. And so much high performance pressure, such a hectic lifestyle, and so many people suffering in silence behind either an artificial mask of a smile or hiding someplace in isolation. I see women in their 60s and 70s with visible anorexia, and that's just the very, very smallest amount of eating disorders that there are. And I see them making their compulsive walking rounds around the city, looking gaunt and frail. I know men who exercise compulsively at the cost of their relationships and work, and only one in his 50s has opened up about it to me once before disappearing again. He used to be this company exec who was a triathlete, and I only got to know him because I read an article about him where he was praised beyond words for his, quote, discipline and willpower. And I later met him by coincidence, and I thought, maybe it's best if I share my struggles with him and see if he opens up, because I had this feeling that something wasn't quite as cool as it might have seemed on the outside. And I had this inkling that his so-called discipline wasn't all that healthy. And when I opened up, he then told me that it was really like a compulsion for him and that he couldn't stop, and it then spiraled out of control. And I later learned that it cost him his job and his marriage. And when I last saw him, he was but a shadow of the man he once was. But he did not stay in contact and has isolated himself, I guess. Shame again, and he has not responded to my messages. I see and feel those people, and I have no way of connecting to them because the wall of shame is just too high. And it's also what I heard from people who actually wanted to start new support groups here in Switzerland, that it's really, really hard to even find people who actually show up. And I mean, when I look to the US or Canada or the UK or Australia, I can't help but state that you guys are doing a lot better in that regard. You're doing a good job. I wish we had more openness with these issues. And when I hear people talk about how much healing they find in their respective support groups, where they find these magic moments of people saying, hey, me too, I get that sinking loneliness. Because I know that I only found a feeling of not being alone with my struggles after I started Googling stuff and found information in English. I found YouTube videos, I found podcasts, I found websites. None of that was in German. And that's also exactly the reason why this podcast is happening in English. Because when I talked about my issues in German or Swiss German, I met with silence. And when I realized that I needed to connect to people, that I wanted to share, that I needed to be heard and create a platform where people can gather and find resources and great guests, there was no other option than to do it in English, I wouldn't even have found guests to interview in my own language. I don't know of anyone here. Isn't that sad? Isn't that wrong? I don't know. This country is small, it's divided, and it's always been based on keeping up appearances. And I can only imagine how much damage this really does to the individuals who are internally breaking down with all this pressure, yet who are too afraid to speak up and seek help. And maybe I'm just projecting here, but I feel the fear of other people, and I feel the severe disconnect from which we all suffer, and it hurts. And not all of that is Switzerland specific, of course, not by a long stretch. It's a worldwide issue, sadly, that we all need more authentic connections, acceptance, and places of healing. So anyway, speaking of tangentially speaking, let's get back to the piece that I wrote for this culture group. The reason why I even decided to release the piece on my podcast is actually a message that I got from a woman who lives in Geneva, the French-speaking part of Switzerland. Apparently, by coincidence, she came across this written piece and she wrote a message to me. And the message said, quote, "My husband and I recently moved to Geneva, and your article about Switzerland has helped me in understanding more about this country and the people that I encounter. I was truly confused about the Swiss from my lack of knowledge. It could have taken me years or never to figure out what was going on underneath the perfect picture here. I love Geneva, but I have an uncomfortable relationship with some people, and your article really enlightened me to the possible causes. I am an American, I suppose, but I also have worked for a very long time to be open and honest, authentic, I like to think. The clash of my life's work and Swiss culture were not definable until I read your article. So yes, it has been extremely helpful to me. Life-changing, LOL, not to be dramatic, but seriously, I would say to my friends all the time, I love Geneva except for the people, which isn't really true, but I couldn't quite figure it out. No question, I had and still have enormous amounts of adapting to do, but there was something else I couldn't place. I am, at 50 years old, starting a whole new life in many ways. Exploring the world for more and new information led me to your article and then your podcast. You are clearly dedicated to exploring as well. I admire your openness and ability to communicate. I look forward to listening to your past and future podcast episodes. And that message meant the world to me because it was completely unexpected. And I figured, hey, I could release my article in audio format as a podcast episode too. Who knows? Maybe other people will find it helpful or interesting or all of the above. And by the way, Janet, the woman who wrote this message to me, has also recently become a Patreon of this show, which makes me even happier. And speaking of happy, this week, it has been epic when it comes to Patreon and new supporters. I don't even know how to express how floored I am over the number of people that have become Patreons in just 1 week. Because it wasn't just Janet who jumped on board on patreon.com. It was also Heather and Lorna and Sarah and Kim and Serena and Daphne and Pamela and Hannah and Kathy and Tara. Can you believe it, radicals? When my inner gremlin warned me in its most vicious tones from asking you for help, and I did it despite it feeling horribly vulnerable, you guys showed up. It's amazing. And I'm deeply grateful. Your support and the community we have on Facebook, it's all really, keeping my mojo lit up. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. You're just effing amazing people. And if anyone out there feels like becoming a Patreon too, please do. It doesn't matter how big or small your pledge is because every pledge counts. And I appreciate your help a lot. It really makes this whole show possible. And I will continue to bring you my best work, or at least I'll do my very best to do so. So find out everything on patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. That's patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. You're the best. And now, here's my piece, lovelies. Enjoy it. So, Switzerland. What comes to mind? Swiss cheese? Skiing in the Alps? Alpine meadows, maybe? Or yodeling? Switzerland is a picture-perfect postcard of a country. Switzerland's tourism board has been bending backward to present a clean, proper, idyllic, and somewhat fairy tale image of our country, sanitized cuteness served with a side of gold. To round this off, Zurich repeatedly ranks as one of the top 3 cities in terms of standard of living. And yet, as someone who has spent her life living in Switzerland, I'm aware of what lies behind the postcard and the terrible price that Switzerland's quest to look perfect can take on the society's individuals. But first of all, let me say this. Yes, it is wonderful to be able to live here. The nature, the landscape, the territory, it's so stunningly beautiful that it's humbling. Hiking, mountaineering, sailing, rafting, biking, skiing, camping. Our love of the outdoors it's in our nature. And we do place a lot of value in taking care of that. And yet Switzerland is not perfect. It's perfectionist. Breaking news. Humans have flaws. We make mistakes. And in any society, people struggle. So when you're committed to seeming perfect at any cost, you're often just denying any problems rather than actually working through them. However, before we dig into what lies behind the picture postcard image, let's look at why Switzerland is such a perfectionist. Just like individual perfectionists, the Swiss culture's perfectionism comes out of a deep, deep sense of insecurity. In Switzerland's case, it looks a lot like geographical insecurity. France, Germany, Italy, Austria, and the countries, principalities, and empires that preceded them, mind you, have long looked at Switzerland like a piece of delicious Swiss chocolate that they wanted to break a piece off from and devour. So why did the Swiss survive this long? Well, thank the Alps. These massive walls of rock that run through our country seem predestined to serve as protection. They're almost insurmountable. Even to us, it's a hassle to get across the north-south axis, and there are only very few actual roads connecting the north and the south of the country. So in case of a threat, let's all hide and attack from there. Ground troops will never be able to find us and conquer us. And with our cannons and weapons hidden in the massives, they would never know what hit them. That was pretty much the doctrine. The Swiss developed a highly disciplined military culture that led to them being the most prized mercenaries in Europe, and they often served as the personal guards of kings. To this day, the Swiss Guard is in charge of protecting the Pope in the Vatican. This military culture often comes as a surprise to people outside of Switzerland who think of Switzerland and think of neutrality. However, these are actually the two sides of the Swiss strategy for survival. Project neutrality and harmlessness, but always be ready for a fight if it comes. Switzerland, like the infamous Swiss Army knife, is ready for anything. This strategy of acting harmless, but actually being deadly, is a classic evolutionary strategy that is used by many animals. And Switzerland's precision, discipline, and commitment to order manifests in the country running like, well, a Swiss watch. However, the historical fear of taking a side in any of the conflicts around us leads the Swiss to often act without conscience. In 1942, for example, our federal council said, quote, "The boat is full," unquote, describing our country as the life raft in the midst of the unfolding hell of World War II. Well, the boat wasn't full. Our highly restrictive refugee politics were soaked in anti-Semitic views, and playing nice with the Germans was more important than the lives of thousands of Jews who were literally running from the devil. The boat was only full for them. This lack of moral conscience manifests in our arms stealing. According to data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and the World Bank, we are the 5th biggest arms supplier per capita in the world. So we are only sending some military equipment like anti-aircraft guns, naval weapons, and planes, and we're only sending them to regimes accused of human rights abuse, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, and China. In part, you could say this comes back to the Alps again, because there just aren't that many ways to make a living in the mountains. You can raise cows and then turn that milk into cheese for long-distance transport. You can use Swiss neutrality to promise people a place to keep their money safe as a banker. You can be a mercenary. And you can promote a picture-perfect image that both drives tourism and distracts people from your status as an arms dealer and a banker to the world's criminals. Now, talking about these problems with my fellow Swiss people, that is virtually impossible, because the Swiss are always on guard. They remain emotionally bottled up and pretty unwilling to reveal any sense of imperfection. If you've ever seen the movie Election, Reese Witherspoon's Tracy Flick is amazingly Swiss in her thinking. You know, sometimes cleanliness is achieved by cleaning up and dealing with problems. However, often in Switzerland, problems are simply being ignored or being swept under the rug. During the 80s, for example, Switzerland had no clue as to how to deal with heroin addiction that became more and more of a problem in this country. And so, with the typical focus on Swiss cleanliness, Zurich began handing out clean needles in its main park. Well, by the 90s, the quote, needle park had gotten out of control. The whole world gasped in shock at the filth of Zurich's drug scene, the obscenity of thousands of drug addicts in the streets, so close to Zurich's main station. That wasn't quite the image we wanted to market to the world, was it? So in came the police, and within a few days, there were no more drug addicts on the streets. Out of sight, out of mind. But you guessed it, those people are still out there, suffering in hiding, disavowed. So I think this Swiss obsession with perfection leads us Swiss to build invisible Alps between each other, and that leads to a deep sense of disconnection. In the densely urbanized, highly industrialized plateau, people tend to hide their, heaven forbid, vulnerability behind things like accumulated degrees, sculpted bodies, fancy houses, well-groomed kids that are on Ritalin often, or impressive job titles or some sort of fame. You know, the I am somebody trap. And in the more rural areas, people tend to hide behind non-communication, closed-offness, vigilance, and utter mistrust of anything that's not exactly like them. You know, the everyone but me sucks trap. And this closed-offness often leads to foreigners, you know, people with different cultural blind spots, seeing things about the Swiss that they can't see about themselves. So they ask, why are you Swiss so uptight? Why are you Swiss so emotionally anemic? Why are you guys working all the time? Why are you Swiss not spontaneous? Why are you Swiss so unfunny? And do you Swiss people have sex at all? And just for the record, dating in Switzerland? Well, that's like trying to tunnel through the Alps. It's effing hard. So all of what I previously said leads to Switzerland having a pretty debatable national identity. But let's jump back in time for a second. The emergence of the nation goes back to the founding oath in 1291, when the three original cantons, which is something like a province, when the three of the original cantons concluded an alliance. And gradually, over time, other regions joined the Confederation and we became something like a patchwork country. Not really because of a shared identity, but rather because it was only by banding together for our mutual defense that any canton stood a chance against the Germans, French, Italians, or Austrians. So we may not like the other cantons much, but we like being eaten by the Germans even less. Personally, as many of you from a very young age, I realized I wasn't perfect, and I realized as well that admitting weakness was going to be my social suicide. And so, as I'll detail in my own cultural confession, I went to extraordinary lengths to try and be something I wasn't. As a person with some fame in Switzerland, I've tried to address these topics. But while the world was ready and eager to hear my realness, my thoughts, and my questions, my Swiss fellow men and fellow women were not. And I shouldn't have been surprised, because why would they admit weakness? Why would they talk about it? That would be social suicide. Like Tracy Flick, on the outside, many Swiss people are picture-perfect facade, but on the inside, we're emotional Swiss cheese. And let me finish this by going on a little tangent, because what Americans call Swiss cheese is actually one of the most boring, bland kind of Swiss cheeses. Entre nous, it is quite rubbery. It's Emmentaler, and I hardly ever see a Swiss person eat it. We call it rubber eagle. Oh, and as for many of those Swiss labeled goods I see in grocery stores overseas, sorry to bum you out, people, but those are so not Swiss. Swiss rolls and Swiss Miss? No, look, we wouldn't dare to sell you such crap, nor would we eat it. Why would we? It's less than perfect. So, that was my piece. I hope you liked it, lovelies. And in case you're wondering if Switzerland is at all worth visiting, yes, it is. It's beautiful. And if you want authenticity, you know where to find me. Until next week, radicals.
This was today's dose of badassery from Life Unrestricted. Find the show notes with links to everything we mentioned in this episode over at lifeunrestricted.org. And if this show is making you feel good, awesome, make sure to subscribe and please let others feel good too. By leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, you'll help make this show more visible and therefore more accessible for others. You're the best. Thanks.